Hey guys, tonight we are stepping aboard a creaking, salt-soaked, absolutely miserable wooden vessel somewhere in the medieval world, and we are going to find out exactly why being a sailor during this era was one of the worst career decisions a human being could possibly make. Picture yourself standing on a dock in, say, 1200 something. The air smells like fish guts and low tide. The ship in front of you looks smaller than you remembered when you agreed to this. The man who recruited you is already walking away very quickly. Somewhere below deck, something is squeaking, and you are not entirely sure if it is the wood or the rats. You probably won't survive this, statistically speaking, and that is not us being dramatic. That is just the medieval maritime employment contract, more or less. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because there is something deeply comforting about knowing that people all over the world are lying in their beds right now, very grateful they are not medieval sailors. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you are a medieval sailor. Let's back up and figure out how you even got here, because nobody grows up dreaming of dying of scurvy in the middle of the Atlantic. The story of how ordinary men ended up on these extraordinarily dangerous ships is, at its heart, a story about not having very many other options. You are probably not nobility. You are probably not a merchant, not a landowner, not a craftsman with a guild and a warm shop and a reasonable life expectancy. You are, statistically, someone from the lower rungs of medieval society, a fisherman's son, maybe, or a boy from a coastal village where the economy begins and ends with the sea. Perhaps your father sailed. Perhaps his father did too. The ocean is not some exotic frontier to you. It is the backyard, the workplace, the thing that swallowed your uncle 3 winters ago and never gave him back. The medieval world along the coastlines of Europe, from the fjords of Norway down through the English Channel, along the Atlantic face of Iberia, into the Mediterranean and beyond, was deeply, structurally connected to maritime trade. Goods moved by water because roads were, to put it generously, suggestions. A cart of wool traveling overland from one English town to another might take days and arrive damaged, robbed, or simply lost. A ship carrying the same wool, if it arrived at all, could move vastly more cargo in a fraction of the time. So merchants needed ships, ships needed sailors, and sailors needed to come from somewhere. That somewhere was usually grinding poverty. Historians still argue about whether medieval sailors were drawn more by genuine maritime culture, an inherited tradition of seafaring passed down through generations, or simply by economic desperation with no better alternatives. The truth is probably both, depending on the region and the era, but one thing is pretty consistent across the records we have. The pay was not good, the conditions were known to be terrible, and men signed on anyway, which tells you something important about what their other options looked like. When a ship was being crewed up, whether it was a merchant cog preparing to haul grain from the Baltic, a fishing vessel heading out for the North Sea herring season, or a royal warship being assembled for some king's ambitious and probably ill-conceived military adventure, the recruitment process was not exactly sophisticated. A shipmaster or his agent would appear in a port town, sometimes with a physical list of the voyage's destination and pay, more often just with a loud voice and a willingness to buy a round of drinks. This was not coincidental. Alcohol played a meaningful role in maritime recruitment, not because sailors were uniquely susceptible to poor decision-making under the influence, though that helped, but because the tavern was genuinely the social and economic hub of port life. It was where you heard news, made contacts, settled disputes, and yes, sometimes agreed to sail to places you had never heard of for pay that would arrive, maybe if the voyage succeeded, if the cargo sold, if the ship came back, if you came back. Pay structures on medieval ships were complicated and often unfair by design. There were different arrangements depending on the type of voyage. On merchant vessels, sailors might receive a combination of fixed wages and a small share of the cargo profits, which sounds generous until you realize that the merchant and the shipmaster took the lion's share of those profits, and the ordinary sailor's cut amounted to just enough to survive between voyages. Fishermen often worked on a share system too, where the catch was divided according to a hierarchy that left the men who did the most dangerous work with the smallest portions. On military or royal vessels, you might receive a daily rate of pay, which sounds more reliable, except that kings were notoriously, almost legendarily bad at actually paying their sailors on time or at all. There was also, in various places and periods, the delightful medieval tradition of impressment, which is the polite historical term for grabbing men off the street and forcing them onto ships whether they wanted to go or not. The English crown, in particular, had a well-documented habit of this during wartime. If you lived in a coastal town and had the misfortune of being physically capable and not quick enough to hide when the king's agents came through, you could find yourself suddenly employed in His Majesty's Navy, with very little say in the matter. Your family would receive some nominal acknowledgement of your service. You would receive a bunk, eventually, and the honor of serving, which you could contemplate on the way to wherever the king had decided to send his ships this season. But let's say you are going voluntarily. Let's say you have made the rational, considered decision that sailing is your best option. You are standing on that dock, you have collected your advance, usually a portion of your expected pay given up front, a system that sounds generous but was really designed to make sure you showed up, since you had now technically spent money you hadn't earned yet, and you are looking at the ship. You have probably sailed before, at least locally. If you grew up in a fishing village, you know boats. You know the smell of them, the movement of them, the particular way they talk to you through the soles of your feet when the sea changes mood. But the ship in front of you now is different from a fishing skiff. It is bigger, more complicated, more creaking, and it is going somewhere far. It is going somewhere that, depending on the decade and the destination, might not appear on any map you have ever seen. Or it might appear on a map, but the map might be wrong in ways you won't discover until you are already out there, which is a problem we will spend considerable time with later. Your fellow sailors are gathering on the dock around you. Take a moment to look at them. These are your crewmates, your bunkmates, the men you will be living in extremely close proximity to for weeks or months. They are, on the whole, not the romantic, rugged seafarers of popular imagination. They are tired-looking men of various ages, some very young, boys really, perhaps 12 or 13, serving as ship's boys and doing the most thankless tasks aboard, and some quite old for the era, which means men in their 40s who look like they have been marinated in salt water and regret for decades, because they have. There are a few who look genuinely capable and weathered in a reassuring way. There are more who look like they have made some significant life errors and are hoping this voyage will somehow balance the ledger. Medieval ship crews were not large by modern standards. A typical merchant cog of the high medieval period might carry somewhere between 10 and 30 men, depending on its size. A larger naval vessel could carry considerably more, sometimes including soldiers who were passengers rather than crew, adding another layer of chaos to the social dynamics below deck. Within that crew, there was a fairly rigid hierarchy. At the top was the master, essentially the captain and navigator combined, the man responsible for the ship and everything on it. Below him, on larger vessels, might be a mate or a pilot. Then the experienced sailors, the ordinary sailors, and at the bottom, the ship's boys, who did everything no one else wanted to do and got paid almost nothing for the privilege. You are probably somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy. Experienced enough to be trusted with real work, not experienced enough to have any meaningful authority. This is in many ways the worst place to be, because you have all of the responsibility and none of the decision-making power. When the master makes a call you think is wrong, and there will be moments, many moments, when you are quite certain the master is wrong, you have very limited recourse. Medieval maritime discipline was strict and physical. Questioning the master's judgment openly was the kind of thing that could get you beaten, tied to the mast, or in extreme cases put off the ship at the nearest land, which might be an uninhabited stretch of coastline somewhere that was not your home. The pre-departure period on the dock is actually one of the better moments of the voyage, and it is worth savoring because things are about to stop being good for quite a long time. There is activity, noise, purpose. Cargo is being loaded, heavy barrels rolling across the gangplank, bales of goods being lowered into the hold, provisions for the voyage being stacked and stored. There is a sense of communal effort, almost festive, that the medieval port seems to generate at departure time. People have come to see ships off. Merchants are checking their cargo manifests with anxious eyes. Wives and children of sailors are gathered at a respectful distance, wearing the particular expression of people who have done this before and know exactly what it means. There might be a priest or a blessing of some kind. Religion was not incidental to medieval seafaring, it was structural. Ships carried religious icons. Sailors made vows to patron saints before difficult voyages. The church calendar shaped when ships sailed and when they didn't. St. Elmo, St. Nicholas, St. Brendan, the medieval sailor had a full roster of heavenly advocates to call upon, and he called upon them frequently and sincerely, because when you have exhausted the material options, the ropes, the sails, the navigation tools, the prayers of your master, you still have the saints, and at least they are free. The cargo is loaded. The provisions are stowed. The crew is assembled, more or less. The master is doing something at the stern that involves looking at the sky and the water in a way that is meant to convey confidence. The lines are being cast off, and the dock is slowly, gently, irrevocably beginning to pull away from you, and the ship is moving, and the smell of the town, even a medieval port town which smelled genuinely awful, is fading behind you, and ahead there is just the open water, gray-green and vast and completely indifferent to your continued existence. This is the moment. This is where it begins. And somewhere in the back of your mind, beneath the noise and the motion and the genuine human excitement of departure, there is a small, sensible voice noting that the ship is already making a sound it possibly shouldn't be making, and the horizon ahead is a very long way away, and you left your advance pay at the tavern last night, and you cannot remember if you ate this morning. Welcome aboard. It is going to be a long voyage. The ship is yours now. Not in the ownership sense, you own nothing on this vessel, including, arguably, your own labor for the duration of the contract, but in the sense that this creaking, groaning, perpetually damp wooden world is your entire universe for the foreseeable future, and you had better get acquainted with it quickly, because understanding its quirks and failures might be the difference between arriving somewhere and not arriving anywhere ever again. Let's start with what the ship actually is, because medieval vessels varied enormously depending on where you are, what era we are talking about, and what the ship is supposed to be doing. The medieval period spans roughly 1,000 years, which is an almost comically long time, and maritime technology changed significantly across those centuries. The Viking longship of the early medieval period, low, sleek, built for speed and beach landings, powered by oars and a single square sail, is a fundamentally different machine from the high-sided merchant cog that dominated northern European trade routes by the 13th and 14th centuries, which is itself quite different from the lateen-rigged vessels that navigated the Mediterranean with their distinctive triangular sails catching wind from angles that would leave a northern square rigger completely helpless. So when we talk about your ship, we are talking about a category rather than a specific design, but certain miseries are universal enough that they apply across the whole tradition. Your ship is made of wood. This seems obvious, but it is worth sitting with for a moment, because wood is a living material even after it has been cut and shaped and hammered into planks, and it behaves accordingly. Wood swells when it gets wet. Wood shrinks when it dries out. Wood rots when it stays wet for long enough. Wood gets eaten by shipworms, the Teredo novalis, a genuinely horrifying little mollusk that bores through submerged timber like a slow, relentless drill, honeycombing a ship's hull from the outside in ways that are completely invisible until the structural damage is already done. The medieval shipwright knew all of this, and worked with it as best he could, using techniques developed over generations. Caulking the seams between planks with oakum and tar, applying various protective coatings to the hull below the waterline, selecting timber carefully for different parts of the vessel, but there was no solving the fundamental problem that putting wood in salt water indefinitely is not something the wood particularly enjoys. The result is that your ship leaks. Not catastrophically, not right now, but persistently and democratically. A little here, a little there, water finding its way in through 1,000 invisible gaps and working its way down into the bilge, that lowest interior space of the hull where all the water that gets into a ship eventually ends up. The bilge on a medieval vessel is one of the more unpleasant environments in the known world, which is saying something given the competition. It collects not just water but everything that falls through the ship from above, scraps of food, human waste, animal waste if the ship is carrying livestock, dead rats, living rats, the remains of things that were once identifiable and are no longer. The smell that rises from the bilge and permeates the lower decks of a medieval ship is something that people who have reconstructed historical vessels describe with a kind of awed disgust, as though no modern vocabulary is quite adequate for it. Keeping the bilge from filling up and sinking the ship was a continuous, rotating labor called bilge pumping, and it fell to the crew on a regular schedule. The hand pumps used on medieval vessels were simple but physically demanding. You are working a wooden pump handle up and down for extended periods, shifting water from the bottom of the ship up and over the side, and you are doing this in a space that is dark and smells like everything we just discussed, and you are doing it every day, and it is one of many jobs on a medieval ship that was absolutely essential and offered absolutely no glory whatsoever. Now let's talk about the space you live in, because it is important to calibrate your expectations immediately. There is no cabin for you. Cabins, to the extent that they existed on medieval vessels at all, were for the master on larger ships. A small, partitioned space at the stern that offered a very modest degree of privacy and dignity. Everyone else lived in the open space of the hull, which on a typical medieval merchant vessel was primarily given over to cargo. You sleep where you can find space, on the deck if the weather allows, below deck among the barrels and bales and general cargo when it does not. You have no bunk, no hammock in the early medieval period, no dedicated personal space of any kind. You have whatever you carried aboard with you, which was probably a wool blanket, a spare shirt if you were organized, and whatever food you thought to bring for the early days of the voyage before the ship's provisions took over. The below-deck space was not designed for human comfort because it was not designed for humans at all. It was designed for cargo, and you were accommodated in it as an afterthought. The headroom was often insufficient to stand upright. The light was minimal, coming through hatches that were sealed shut in bad weather. The ventilation was whatever leaked in around those hatches, which meant that below deck during a sealed storm was an experience of air quality that can most charitably be described as challenging, and less charitably described as a sealed wooden box containing 20 unwashed men, a collection of rotting provisions, bilge gases rising from below, and whatever the livestock had contributed to the atmosphere recently. Historians still argue about how medieval sailors actually organized their sleeping arrangements, whether there were informal territorial understandings about who slept where, whether senior sailors claimed better positions by tradition, whether the ship's boys were simply wedged into whatever space was left. But the consensus is that comfort was not a significant factor in any arrangement that was made. You slept when you could, where you could, and the fact that the ship was in constant motion, rolling and pitching with the sea, was simply a condition of existence rather than something that prevented sleep, because you adapted, as humans do, and after a few nights the motion became the normal state, and stillness, when you eventually found it again on land, would feel deeply wrong. The deck itself, the main working surface of the ship, was your primary environment during the day, and it was a place that required constant, wary attention. A medieval ship's deck was not a smooth, wide-open platform. It was an obstacle course of ropes, cleats, hatch covers, barrels lashed to the rail, coils of spare line, and the general accumulated debris of a working vessel. The ropes alone, the rigging that controlled the sails, formed a complex three-dimensional web that experienced sailors navigated instinctively but that could catch an ankle or a neck with lethal efficiency in the wrong circumstances. In heavy weather, the deck became additionally interesting because it was also wet, heeled at an angle, and moving unpredictably in 3 dimensions simultaneously. Falling overboard from a medieval ship was, in almost every circumstance, a death sentence. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is a straightforward consequence of the technology available. Life-saving equipment did not exist in any meaningful form. A rope might be thrown if someone went over the side and the crew reacted quickly enough and the ship's motion allowed it, but stopping or turning a sailing vessel to retrieve a man overboard was a slow, complicated process that required conditions the sea rarely provided on demand. If you went overboard in anything but calm, flat water, close to shore, with a fast response from the crew, you drowned. This was understood by everyone on board. It was one of the reasons experienced sailors were often cautious on deck in a way that looked like slowness to outsiders but was actually a kind of professional survival instinct, a constant low-level awareness of where the rail was, where the wet patches were, where a sudden lurch might throw you. The rigging, all those ropes and spars above your head, was another environment in itself because sailing a medieval ship required people to go up into it. The sails needed to be raised, lowered, reefed in heavy weather, repaired, and adjusted constantly, and most of this work was done by men climbing the shrouds, the rope ladders that led up to the tops of the masts, and working out on the yards the horizontal spars from which the sails hung, often in conditions that would make a modern safety officer weep openly into their clipboard. You worked the rigging in the rain, in the wind, in the dark, with frozen hands on foot ropes. Simple ropes strung below the yards for your feet, with nothing below you but the deck and the sea. at heights that would be alarming enough on solid ground and were considerably more alarming on a moving ship. The mast itself was an engineering concern of the first order. Medieval masts were single pieces of timber on smaller vessels, or built up from multiple pieces on larger ones, and they were subject to enormous forces in heavy wind. A mast failure, a snap, a split, a catastrophic failure of the rigging that supported it, was one of the more serious emergencies a medieval sailor could face, because a fallen mast didn't just take the sail with it. It took ropes, spars, possibly men, and often punched through the deck on its way down, introducing a new and exciting structural problem to what was already a bad day. The records of medieval voyages are dotted with mast failures, and the solutions available were generally improvised, physically brutal, and only partially successful. The ship also carried animals. This was not optional. Livestock were the most practical way of having fresh meat available on a longer voyage, and on a medieval ship with no refrigeration of any kind, fresh meat was the only meat that wasn't going to make you significantly ill. So there were chickens, sometimes a pig or two, occasionally goats, living in whatever space could be made for them on deck or below. They contributed to the overall sensory environment of the ship in all the ways you are imagining. They also contributed to the unpredictable weight distribution that affected how the ship handled, and on a vessel where cargo was already shifting in heavy seas, a panicking pig was an additional variable that nobody needed. The rats, of course, were not invited but came anyway. Rats on medieval ships were not a problem that anyone had solved or expected to solve. They were simply a condition, like the leaking or the smell. They lived in the hold, they ate the provisions, they gnawed on ropes and woodwork, they spread disease, and they were present on essentially every vessel in numbers that fluctuated with the food supply but never reached zero. Sailors kept cats aboard partly for the rats and partly one suspects because a cat is at least a consistent and warming presence in an environment that offers very little warmth of any kind. The ship's cat was often treated with genuine affection, which makes complete sense when you consider that it was probably the most comfortable creature on the vessel. Then there is the question of how the ship actually stayed together, which is less reassuring than you might hope. Medieval shipbuilding was skilled work, practiced by craftsmen who knew their materials and their methods intimately and built vessels that were genuinely impressive achievements of pre-industrial engineering. But they were also working without standardization, without the ability to test structural loads in any systematic way, without the material science that would eventually allow shipbuilders to understand exactly why certain designs worked and others failed. They worked by tradition, by the accumulated wisdom of generations, and mostly it worked until it didn't. The caulking between the planks, that tarred oakum stuffed into every seam to keep the water out, needed constant maintenance. In heavy weather, the working of the hull, the constant flexing and twisting as the ship responded to wave forces, opened gaps in the caulking, and the caulking needed to be replaced, driven back in, retard. This was done at sea when necessary, by men working with mallets and caulking irons, sometimes on the outer hull from a boat alongside or from ropes over the side, which added another item to the long list of terrifying things that were nonetheless routine on a medieval vessel. And through all of this, the leaking, the rats, the cramped sleeping, the rigging work in the dark, the smells rising from the bilge, the animals, the caulking maintenance, the constant pumping, the ship is moving. It is always moving. It rolls in the swell when there is no wind and the sail hangs slack and the oars, if there are oars, are pulled by exhausted men going nowhere fast. It pitches and heaves in bad weather until the horizon tilts at angles that the human visual system is not really designed to process calmly. It shudders when a wave hits the hull at a bad angle, a deep physical thud that you feel in your teeth and your spine simultaneously, a reminder that between you and the ocean floor there is nothing but a few inches of increasingly questionable wood. You get used to it. You have to get used to it. The medieval sailor's adaptability to the physical environment of the ship is one of the genuinely impressive things about these men. The way the body and mind accommodate themselves to a world that is objectively, persistently hostile, and find within it a kind of home. There are rhythms to it. The watch rotations, the maintenance schedules, the daily routines that structure time and give the formless ocean crossing some shape and meaning. There is community in it, rough and frequently unpleasant community, but community nonetheless. But that doesn't mean it is good. It just means it is yours, this leaking, groaning, rat-infested, bilge-smelling, perpetually wet wooden box that is somehow also your home, your workplace, and your primary survival mechanism all at once. Sleep well on that thought. You are hungry. This is not a new sensation. Hunger was a fairly standard background condition for most people in the medieval world, regardless of whether they were on a ship or not, but the particular quality of hunger you experience at sea has a texture and a persistence to it that land-based hunger rarely achieves. On land, hunger is usually a problem with a solution nearby. On a ship in the middle of the ocean, hunger is a problem with a solution that is rationed, carefully controlled, slowly diminishing, and increasingly terrible in quality the longer the voyage goes on. Let's talk about what you eat because it is important, and also because it is one of those areas where the historical reality is so much worse than the romantic imagination of medieval seafaring that it deserves proper attention. When people picture a sailor's meal, they sometimes conjure something hearty and rustic, a wooden bowl of stew, maybe, or a thick piece of bread, washed down with something warming. The reality was closer to a wooden bowl of something that was technically food, accompanied by bread that you had to tap on the table first to knock the weevils out, washed down with something that smelled like a decision you would regret. The foundational item of the medieval sailor's diet was ship's biscuit, also called hardtack in later periods, though the basic concept was consistent across the whole medieval era. Ship's biscuit was made from flour and water, baked, and then baked again, specifically to drive out all remaining moisture, because moisture was the enemy of preservation. The result was a dense, flat, extremely hard disk of something that could technically be called bread in the same way that a stone could technically be called a pillow. It did not go soft with age. It did not go moldy quickly, because there was nothing in it for mold to work with. What it did do, given enough time in the damp, dark hold of a ship, was attract weevils, small beetles that bored into the biscuit and laid eggs and generally made themselves at home in a way that added an involuntary protein supplement to every meal. The standard sailor's technique for dealing with weevil-infested biscuit was to tap it firmly on a hard surface before eating, which dislodged most of the weevils. Some sailors preferred to eat in the dark, which solved the problem aesthetically if not practically. The biscuit itself, once you had addressed the weevil situation to whatever degree you were capable of, was essentially tasteless. A dense, jaw-challenging mass that required significant effort to eat and delivered calories with absolutely no pleasure. Softening it in whatever liquid was available helped. Softening it in the ship's drinking water was common. The fact that the ship's drinking water was not always a significant improvement on the biscuit itself is a complication we will get to shortly. The other primary food item was salt meat, beef or pork, more often pork, preserved in barrels of heavily salted brine. Salting meat was the standard medieval preservation method, and it worked reasonably well in that it prevented the meat from going off in the way that fresh meat would. What it did not prevent was the meat from becoming a particular texture and flavor over time that can most accurately be described as an assault. The salt content was enormous. The meat had to be soaked in fresh water for extended periods before cooking to make it anything approaching edible, and fresh water on a ship was a rationed resource, which created a constant tension between making the salt meat less terrible and conserving the water supply for drinking. After the soaking, the meat was boiled. Almost everything on a medieval ship that could be cooked was boiled, because boiling was the one cooking method available on a vessel where open fire was a terrifying risk and cooking arrangements were minimal at best. The ship's cook, who occupied a social position somewhere between essential and despised, worked over a firebox, a contained hearth, usually set on sand or stone on deck or in a protected space, with a cauldron, and produced from the ship's provisions something that was hot and could be swallowed. The quality of the ship's cook had an enormous impact on crew morale and, by extension, on the smooth running of the entire voyage, which meant that a good cook was genuinely valued and a bad cook was a source of constant, simmering, appropriately enough, resentment. The salt pork or beef, boiled long enough to be chewable, was often combined with whatever dried legumes the ship carried, peas, beans, lentils, to produce a kind of thick, heavy soup or pottage that was the closest thing to a complete meal available at sea. This pottage was filling in the way that concrete is filling, and about as flavorful, but it delivered calories and it was warm, and on a cold, wet ship in the North Atlantic those were not trivial virtues. Sometimes the pottage was seasoned with whatever spices or dried herbs were available, which on a well-provisioned merchant vessel might be relatively decent and on a poorly stocked naval ship might be nothing at all. Fish was also a significant part of the medieval sailor's diet, particularly on voyages that stayed close enough to productive fishing grounds. The ability to catch fresh fish at sea provided a genuine nutritional supplement to the preserved provisions, and sailors fished whenever they could, trailing lines over the stern, setting nets when conditions allowed. Fresh fish was a luxury in the context of the ship's overall diet, something that broke the monotonous texture of hardtack and salt meat with actual flavor and freshness. Preserved fish, dried cod, salt herring, was also commonly carried as provision, and while it shared some of the general saltiness of the salt meat, it was at least a different kind of terrible, which counts for something. Now let's talk about water, because this is where things get philosophically interesting. Human beings need fresh water to survive. Ships are surrounded by water, vast, world-spanning quantities of water, and none of it is drinkable. This basic geographical irony was not lost on medieval sailors, who managed the fresh water supply with a care and anxiety that no other provision received. Water for a voyage was stored in wooden barrels, casks of various sizes sealed and stowed in the hold, and the total supply represented a fixed, diminishing resource from the moment the ship left port. Wooden barrels were not ideal water containers, particularly for long voyages. The wood imparted flavors to the water over time, earthy, tannic, often deeply unpleasant, and unless the barrels were scrupulously clean when filled, which they frequently were not, algae and bacteria established themselves in the stored water and began doing what algae and bacteria do, which was to make the water progressively greener, cloudier, slimier, and more aromatic as the voyage continued. Medieval sailors were drinking this water not because they didn't notice the quality they absolutely noticed, but because it was what there was, and the alternative was dying of thirst, which was worse. The solution that medieval seafarers arrived at, with the practical wisdom of people who had tried the alternatives, was to drink as little of the water as possible and to substitute other liquids wherever they could. The most important substitute was beer or ale. This was not recreational, or not primarily recreational anyway. Beer, even the weak small beer commonly produced for daily consumption, was safer to drink than the ship's water supply for the very good reason that the brewing process involved boiling, which killed most of the things that would otherwise kill you. A barrel of ale stayed drinkable longer than a barrel of water in the same conditions, and it provided calories along with hydration. Medieval ships carried significant quantities of ale as a primary provision, not as a luxury. The problem was that ale ran out. On a voyage that was supposed to take 4 weeks and took 6 because of adverse winds, a routine occurrence in the medieval period, as we will discuss at considerable length, the ale supply was calibrated for the expected duration, and when it was gone, and you were left with the water, and the water was what it was. Wine was carried on Mediterranean voyages and on ships trading to wine-producing regions, and it had similar advantages to ale in terms of safety and caloric content, and similar disadvantages in terms of being a finite resource that ran out at exactly the wrong moment. There was also, in the later medieval and early modern period, the use of vinegar as a water additive. The acidity helped somewhat with the biological situation in the casks, and various herbal preparations were used in different maritime traditions to make the water more palatable or at least less actively horrifying. None of these solutions were more than partially effective. The water problem was not solved in any meaningful sense until distillation technology became practical and widespread, which was well outside the medieval period. The rationing of provisions was a constant source of tension on medieval ships, and it is worth understanding how it worked because it had significant implications for crew relations and, in extreme cases, survival. The ship's master was responsible for managing the provisions, and the daily ration for each crew member was theoretically fixed. So much biscuit, so much meat, so much water or ale, so much of whatever else was available. In practice, the rationing system was subject to all the pressures you might expect: the temptation to consume more than your share, the difficulty of accurate measurement in a moving ship with rough wooden containers, the tendency for provisions to go off faster than anticipated, and the constant uncertainty about how long the voyage was actually going to take. Provisions going bad mid-voyage was not an edge case. It was a routine expectation that experienced masters built into their calculations. Salt meat could develop a rancidity that the salt did not fully prevent, particularly if the quality of the salting had been poor to begin with or the barrels had not been properly sealed. Biscuit that had been inadequately dried before loading went moldy rather than merely weevily, and moldy biscuit was genuinely dangerous rather than just unpleasant. Dried fish went rancid. Dried legumes, if damp, rotted. The ale could go sour. the water became undrinkable. In a worst case, a ship could find itself weeks from port with provisions so compromised that the effective food and water supply was a fraction of what had been loaded, and the calculations that had seemed reasonable in harbor became desperately inadequate at sea. Historians still argue about how often medieval ships experienced genuine provision crises versus how often the records of hardship were exaggerated by sailors who, understandably, emphasized the difficulties of their voyages in retrospect. The truth is almost certainly that serious provision shortages were less common than minor ones, but that minor provision problems, slightly reduced rations, slightly off meat, slightly slimy water, were so routine as to be essentially continuous. You were never well fed on a medieval ship. You were, at best, adequately fueled, which is a different thing entirely. What was entirely absent from the medieval sailor's diet, and absent in ways that had consequences that nobody at the time understood even slightly, was vitamin C. Fresh fruit and vegetables, the primary sources of vitamin C in the human diet, were perishable and therefore largely unavailable on any voyage of significant length. You might have some dried fruit in the early days of a voyage, raisins, dried figs, but these provided only a fraction of the vitamin C that fresh fruit contained, and they were consumed quickly. After a few weeks at sea with no fresh produce, the vitamin C that your body had stored at departure was running low, and after a few more weeks it was essentially gone, and the consequences of that depletion were beginning, quietly and invisibly, to accumulate. We will spend more time with scurvy in a later section, because it deserves the full horror of its own discussion. For now, just know that the medieval sailor's diet was creating a slow physiological crisis that would eventually manifest in gum disease, joint pain, old wounds reopening, and profound exhaustion, and that nobody in the medieval period understood why this was happening or how to prevent it, and that the answer, eat a lemon, was sitting there in the Mediterranean the whole time, completely ignored. The irony of the medieval sailor's nutritional situation is genuinely painful in retrospect. The men who sailed the trade routes that brought spices, preserved foods, and agricultural products from one part of the world to another, who were instrumental in feeding the cities of medieval Europe, were themselves chronically underfed and malnourished in ways that quietly undermined their health and shortened their lives. They were the delivery mechanism for other people's abundance, living on the margins of it, eating hardtack and weevils in the hold while the cargo above them included goods that would have made their diet significantly better. But that is medieval seafaring for you, a system that was extraordinarily effective at moving things from one place to another, and almost entirely indifferent to the welfare of the men who moved them. Tonight, as you contemplate your perfectly comfortable bed and the fact that your kitchen contains food that is neither weevilled nor actively green, spare a small, drowsy thought for the sailor tapping his biscuit on the rail in the dark, watching the weevils fall and eating it anyway, because what else is he going to do? You need to know where you are. This seems like a reasonable requirement, given that you are in the middle of a large body of water with no landmarks, no road signs, no helpful locals to ask for directions, and a ship full of cargo and human beings whose continued existence depends on arriving at the correct destination rather than, say, the wrong coastline at speed in the dark. Unfortunately, knowing where you are on the medieval ocean was significantly harder than it sounds, and the tools available for figuring it out ranged from moderately useful to genuinely optimistic to entirely fictional. And the skill required to use even the moderate ones correctly was unevenly distributed among the men who were supposed to be using them. Navigation is the section of medieval seafaring where the gap between what people imagine, the wise, weathered navigator with his charts and instruments, reading the stars with quiet confidence, and what actually happened, a tired man squinting at a stick and making his best guess, is perhaps most entertainingly wide. So let's close that gap, gently, together, in the dark. The first thing to understand about medieval navigation is that for most of the period and most of the sailors involved, it was not really navigation in the formal sense at all. It was something called coastal pilotage, which means exactly what it sounds like. You stayed close to the coast, you recognized the coastline by its features, you moved from one known headland or bay or harbor to the next, and you did not go far enough out to see that the coast disappeared entirely if you could possibly avoid it. This was the dominant mode of medieval seafaring for centuries, practiced by fishermen and merchants and naval vessels alike. And it worked reasonably well because the coasts of Europe are fairly distinctive, and experienced sailors who had made the same route many times built up a detailed mental library of what everything looked like from the water. Portolan charts, the navigational charts of the medieval Mediterranean and later the Atlantic coasts, were the physical expression of this accumulated coastal knowledge. These were remarkable documents, drawn on vellum, covered in a dense web of compass lines radiating from multiple points, with coastlines rendered in impressive detail based on the accumulated observations of generations of sailors. The harbors, the headlands, the dangerous shoals and rocks, all marked, all annotated, all representing knowledge that had been hard-won by men who had sailed those coasts and survived to report what they found. Historians still argue about exactly how portolan charts were made and how they were used in practice, whether sailors were actively consulting them in real time or using them more as reference tools and general orientation aids, but their existence and their quality are evidence of a sophisticated, if entirely empirical, navigational tradition. The problem with coastal pilotage as a strategy is that it required you to stay near the coast, and the coast was frequently the most dangerous place to be. The open ocean, vast and featureless as it was, at least did not have rocks in it. Coastlines had rocks and shoals and unexpected currents, and the navigational nightmare of a lee shore. A coastline that the wind was blowing you toward, which meant that the same wind powering your sails was simultaneously pushing you onto the rocks, and sailing a medieval vessel away from a lee shore against the wind was a feat that required sea room, skill, and luck in quantities that were not always available simultaneously. A significant proportion of medieval shipwrecks happened not in the open ocean but near coasts, often coasts that the sailors knew perfectly well, because knowing where the rocks are and successfully avoiding them in deteriorating weather are different skills. When medieval sailors did venture away from the coast, across the Bay of Biscay, say, or up into the North Sea, or eventually out into the Atlantic approaches, they needed something to navigate by other than the view. What they had, primarily, was the sky. Stars, particularly the North Star, Polaris, which sits almost exactly above the geographic North Pole and therefore provides a fixed reference point for direction and, crucially, for latitude. The altitude of Polaris above the horizon, measured in degrees, gives you your latitude directly. If Polaris is 30 degrees above the horizon, you are at 30 degrees north latitude, which is a simple and elegant relationship that medieval sailors understood and used. The instrument for measuring this altitude in the medieval period was the quadrant or the astrolabe, devices that allowed you to measure the angle of a star above the horizon by sighting along a fixed arm and reading the angle from a graduated scale. These were real instruments, genuinely useful, and the ability to use them correctly was a skill that distinguished a trained navigator from an ordinary sailor. But using them correctly required steady conditions. You needed to be able to sight on a star without the ship's motion throwing off your reading, which was challenging enough in calm weather and essentially impossible in anything else. You needed clear skies, which the North Atlantic was not famous for providing reliably. And you needed Polaris to be visible, which it was not in overcast conditions, which in the North Atlantic were the norm rather than the exception. The magnetic compass was the other major navigational instrument of the medieval period, and its adoption, which happened gradually across the 12th and 13th centuries in European maritime practice, was genuinely transformative. A compass tells you direction, north, south, east, west, and all the points between. This sounds simple, but its implications were profound, because it meant that you could maintain a consistent heading in conditions where you could not see the stars or the sun, at night, in fog, in overcast weather, which were precisely the conditions in which navigation by celestial observation failed. Medieval compass design evolved from a simple magnetized needle floating on water to the more sophisticated dry compass with a rotating card marked with the compass points, and its use became standard on European vessels during the High Medieval period. The compass had a problem, though, and the problem was magnetic declination, the fact that magnetic north and geographic north are not the same thing, and that the difference between them varies depending on where on Earth you are. Medieval navigators knew that the compass did not point exactly north. They called it the compass's variation or declination, and experienced navigators developed rules of thumb for correcting for it in their home waters. But as ships moved into unfamiliar waters, the declination changed in ways that were not predictable from the rules developed locally, and this introduced systematic errors into navigation that compounded over distance. A ship maintaining what it thought was a consistent easterly heading might, after several days at sea, find itself significantly north or south of where the navigator expected, for reasons that the navigator could not entirely account for. The core medieval navigational technique that combined compass direction with estimated distance was called dead reckoning, and it is the method that gets the least glamorous treatment in popular accounts of medieval seafaring but was probably the most universally used. Dead reckoning works like this: you know where you started, you know what direction you have been traveling, and you know approximately how fast you have been going, therefore you can calculate where you are now. The calculation is simple in principle and deeply unreliable in practice, because each of those three inputs, starting position, direction, and speed, carries its own uncertainty, and those uncertainties compound with distance and time. Speed estimation on a medieval ship was done by feel and experience, occasionally supplemented by a chip log, a piece of wood thrown overboard from the bow, and the time taken for the ship to pass it measured. But this was a crude measurement even when done carefully, and in practice speed was often simply estimated by an experienced sailor who had spent enough time at sea to have an intuitive sense of how fast the ship was moving in various conditions. The variables affecting this, the state of the hull below the waterline, the set and trim of the sails, the direction and strength of ocean currents that the sailor might not even know existed, meant that speed estimates were frequently wrong, sometimes significantly. Currents were a particular problem. The ocean is not a flat, stationary medium through which ships move. It is a dynamic system of moving water, with currents flowing in consistent patterns that were only partially understood in the medieval period. The Gulf Stream, that great river of warm water moving up the eastern American coast and across the North Atlantic toward Europe, was not mapped or named until long after the medieval period, but it existed and affected every ship crossing those waters. A ship moving against a significant current without knowing it was doing so would arrive at dead reckoning positions that were systematically wrong in a consistent direction, the kind of error that accumulated quietly and revealed itself only when the coast appeared somewhere unexpected, or failed to appear where expected. The maps themselves, beyond the portolan charts of the familiar coastal regions, were a source of navigational information that ranged from useful to actively misleading. Medieval mappamundi, the great world maps of the period, were not navigational tools in any practical sense. They were cosmological documents organizing the world according to theological and philosophical principles, with Jerusalem at the center and the ocean at the edges, populated with the dog-headed men and giant-eared people and various monsters that appeared at the margins of the known world. They were magnificent as cultural objects and completely useless for figuring out where you were in the Bay of Biscay. The sea monsters on medieval maps deserve a brief moment of appreciation, because they were not simply decorative. They were, in a genuine sense, the honest acknowledgement of the limits of knowledge, the cartographer's way of saying that beyond the known coastlines and the documented routes, there was territory where the normal rules of the world might not apply, where the sea produced things that defied the ordinary categories of nature. Historians still argue about whether medieval sailors actually believed in sea monsters as literal creatures or understood them as symbolic markers of danger and the unknown. The answer is probably that it varied by individual and by circumstance, and that a sailor who had spent weeks at sea in a medieval ship, exhausted and malnourished and surrounded by an ocean that had been trying to kill him the whole time, was perhaps not in the most rigidly skeptical frame of mind when something large and unexpected appeared in the water alongside the ship. What medieval navigators were extraordinarily good at, given all these limitations, was learning and applying local knowledge. The pilots of the medieval Mediterranean, the Norse navigators of the North Atlantic, the Arab sailors of the Indian Ocean, all operated within traditions of accumulated, transmitted empirical knowledge about specific routes, specific currents, specific weather patterns, specific hazards. This knowledge was passed from experienced to inexperienced sailors through direct instruction and practice, and it was far more detailed and reliable than any single instrument or chart. A Norse navigator crossing from Norway to Iceland had mental models of the route, the prevailing winds at different seasons, the wave patterns, the bird species that indicated particular positions relative to land, the color of the water over different types of sea floor, that constituted a navigational system of genuine sophistication, built not from instruments and mathematics but from generations of careful, costly observation. The cost of errors in medieval navigation was, of course, catastrophic and immediate. A navigational mistake on land means you have gone the wrong way and must retrace your steps, which is annoying. A navigational mistake at sea in the medieval period usually meant one of a small number of outcomes, none of them pleasant. You struck a coast or a shoal you didn't know was there, which ended the voyage abruptly and violently. You ran out of provisions before reaching your destination, which ended it slowly and miserably, or you were lost at sea in a more complete sense, unable to find your way to any known land, which also ended badly, with the precise mechanism left to the imagination and the weather. And through all of this, the squinting at stars, the tapping the compass, the estimating of speed, the consulting of charts that might or might not be accurate for where you currently were, the sea was continuing to do exactly what it always does, which was to be entirely indifferent to your navigational situation. The stars you needed were behind clouds. The wind that would have confirmed your heading had shifted in the night. The coast that should have appeared 2 days ago had not appeared, and the master was looking at his compass and his chart with an expression that you have learned, over the weeks of this voyage, to interpret as meaning that he is not entirely certain where you are either. This is the navigational reality of the medieval ocean, not confident mastery, but a continuous, skilled negotiation with uncertainty, conducted by men who were genuinely expert at managing incomplete information under difficult conditions, and who were right often enough to keep the trade routes open and the ships arriving, and wrong often enough that the seabed of every ocean they sailed is scattered with the evidence of the times they were not. The sky has been changing for the last hour in a way that the master doesn't like, and you have learned enough in the weeks you have been on this ship to trust the master's relationship with the sky. The clouds on the western horizon have gone from white to gray to a particular bruised purple that has no comfortable interpretation. The wind, which was a steady and manageable presence from the southwest all morning, has begun to do something inconsistent and shifty, dropping off, picking up, changing direction slightly, dropping off again, which is the meteorological equivalent of someone going very quiet before they say something you really don't want to hear. The sea has changed texture too, the regular pattern of the swells replaced by something choppier and more confused, waves coming from slightly different angles and occasionally intersecting in ways that make the ship's motion irregular and unsettling in a new way. You are about to experience medieval weather at sea, and there is genuinely nothing to do about it except hold on, work hard, be afraid, and hope. The medieval sailor's relationship with weather was intimate in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of the modern world, where weather is something you check on your phone and occasionally complain about. For the medieval sailor, weather was the dominant fact of existence, the thing that determined whether the voyage succeeded or failed, whether the cargo arrived or sank, whether the crew lived or died. Every other challenge of medieval seafaring, the poor food, the navigational uncertainty, the leaking ship, existed within the framework of whatever the weather decided to do, and the weather could, at any moment, render all of those other challenges academic by ending the voyage entirely. Medieval sailors understood weather empirically and intimately. They read the sky with the same careful attention that a physician applied to reading symptoms, and for much the same reason, the reading might save a life. The color of the sky at different times of day, the shape and movement of clouds, the behavior of the wind at the surface and at height, the way the top of a sail filled differently from the foot, indicating wind shear, the appearance of the sea surface, the behavior of seabirds, the smell of the air, all of these were sources of information about what the weather was about to do, and experienced sailors synthesized them continuously and instinctively. The red sky at morning that sailors take as warning has been in the maritime tradition for so long that it appears in the Bible, which suggests that the observation predates the text by a considerable margin. What medieval sailors could not do was predict weather with any reliability beyond the immediate horizon, because weather prediction in any systematic sense required understanding the large-scale atmospheric dynamics that produce weather systems, and that understanding was centuries away. They could read the immediate signs well. They could not see the storm that was still 2 days away and building in the Atlantic. So the warning time available before a serious storm struck was often very short, hours, sometimes less, and the preparation that could be accomplished in that time was limited by both the speed of preparation and the physical capacity of the crew to perform it. When the warning signs became unmistakable and the master made the call, the ship's response to approaching heavy weather was a controlled emergency. Rapid, physically demanding, requiring coordination from the entire crew. The priority was reducing sail. The sails that were driving the ship were also, in heavy winds, the most dangerous things on it. Enormous areas of fabric catching wind with forces that could snap masts, tear rigging, or simply overpower the helmsman and drive the ship wherever the wind wanted it to go rather than where the crew wanted. Reefing the sails, reducing their area by gathering up and tying off a portion of the fabric, was the first response to rising wind, and on a medieval ship this required men going aloft on the yards in worsening conditions, working with numb hands on wet rope while the ship moved increasingly violently beneath them. In severe conditions, the sails came down entirely. A medieval ship running under bare poles, with no sail set at all, was still being moved by the wind, just more slowly and with less steerage, and the question of what to do with a ship in a serious storm with no effective sail power was one of the central tactical problems of medieval seamanship. The options were essentially 3: run before the storm, which meant letting the wind push you in whatever direction it chose, which was fast and survivable in open water but catastrophic if there was a coast in the way; heave to, which meant arranging what little sail you had in a configuration that roughly balanced the forces on the ship and kept it from moving much in any direction, bobbing in the waves like a very large, very unhappy cork or anchor, which was only possible in shallow water and was its own adventure in a heavy sea. The storm itself, when it arrived fully, was an experience that medieval accounts describe with a consistency that suggests they were reaching for words adequate to something that language was not quite built to handle. The noise was primary. The shrieking of the wind in the rigging, a sound that survivors consistently described as unlike anything on land, a high, sustained scream that was both deafening and deeply, viscerally frightening. Under that, the sound of the sea, not the gentle rhythmic sound of waves that the landlubber imagines, but a massive, chaotic, percussive roar, the sound of enormous quantities of water in violent motion colliding with each other and with the hull of the ship. The waves in a serious North Atlantic storm are a physical phenomenon that is difficult to convey without direct experience. Wave height in major storms routinely reached what modern measurement would classify as extreme: 15, 20, occasionally more meters from trough to crest, walls of water moving at speed toward a wooden ship that was, in those conditions, a very small thing in a very large and violent sea. A medieval cog or hulk, high-sided and relatively slow, handled heavy seas differently from the lower, sleeker vessels of the Norse tradition. It rolled and pitched heavily, presenting its flat sides to the waves in a way that made it prone to being pushed sideways and, in the worst cases, capsized. Capsizing was the nightmare. A ship rolling too far to one side, going past the angle from which it could recover under its own stability, and continuing over. This was an end that came quickly and offered almost no survival. The crew would find themselves in water that was cold enough to incapacitate a person in minutes, surrounded by the wreckage of the ship, in the middle of a storm with no rescue possible. The North Atlantic is so cold at most latitudes and seasons that immersion survival time was measured in minutes rather than hours, which meant that a capsized crew in those waters did not die of drowning, technically. They died of cold incapacitation before they could drown, which is a distinction that offers very little comfort. The ship could also founder, take on water faster than it could be pumped or bailed, becoming progressively heavier and lower in the water until it simply went under. Foundering was slower than capsizing, which in some ways made it worse, because there was time to understand what was happening without being able to do anything effective about it. All hands pumping could not keep pace with serious structural damage or open seams in a ship working heavily in a storm. The water came in faster than human arms could push it out, and the ship settled lower and the pumping became more desperate, and eventually the water was over the deck and there was nowhere left to stand. Storms also drove ships onto coasts, which we touched on briefly in the navigation section but which deserves more attention here because it was probably the most common mechanism of maritime disaster in the medieval period. A ship caught between a storm and a lee shore, with the wind pushing it toward the coast and insufficient sea room or sailing ability to claw away, was in a position that medieval sailors recognized as one of the most dangerous possible. The seamanship of getting off a lee shore was demanding in good conditions. In a storm it was frequently impossible, and the result was the ship being driven onto rocks or shoals with the full force of the storm behind it. Wrecking on a coast was not always immediately fatal. Ships driven ashore sometimes did so at places where the crew could get off and survive, and the cargo, or some of it, could sometimes be salvaged. But it ended the voyage, it ended the ship, and in the medieval period it often ended the crew in one way or another, either directly in the wreck or afterward, stranded on a foreign coast with no ship, no money, no resources, and the long journey home still ahead of them. The coast was also, in the medieval period, populated with people who regarded wrecked ships as a providential resource rather than a humanitarian emergency. And the tradition of wrecking, stripping wrecked ships of their cargo and not necessarily being helpful to the crew in the process, was widespread enough that various medieval laws attempted to address it, with limited success. Between the full disasters, the capsizings, the founderings, the wrecks, there was a large middle territory of damage short of catastrophe that storms routinely inflicted on medieval ships. Rigging carried away, shrouds parting, stays failing, yards coming down, was common enough to be almost routine in severe weather. A broken yard meant a sail that could not be set, which reduced the ship's ability to maneuver and drive. A broken stay meant a mast that was no longer properly supported, which was a structural emergency requiring immediate improvised repair. Damage to the hull, seams opening, planks shifting, the caulking failing under the working stress of heavy seas, meant increased leaking and more urgent pumping. Any of these things individually was manageable with a capable crew and some luck. In combination, in the middle of a storm, with a tired crew that had been working for hours already, the management became much harder. The psychological dimension of surviving a serious storm deserves acknowledgement, because it was real and significant. Fear is a rational response to mortal danger, and a medieval sailor in a serious storm had very good reasons to be afraid. The danger was objective, immediate, and not fully within his control to mitigate. Medieval accounts of storms at sea describe fear openly and without embarrassment, alongside the practical responses to it. The prayers, the vows, the calling on saints, the making of bargains with God about future behavior if the present situation resolved favorably. This was not weakness or irrationality. It was the appropriate response of a human being in a situation where human capability was insufficient and something beyond human capability was the only remaining resource. The aftermath of a storm, if you came through it, had its own particular quality. The exhaustion was profound, the kind that goes into the bones and makes movement feel like working against resistance. The ship needed assessment, every line, every sail, every plank that was accessible checked for damage. The provisions needed checking too because heavy weather inevitably got water into places it shouldn't, and wet provisions were compromised provisions. The crew needed feeding and, if possible, rest, though on a short-handed ship after a storm there was rarely the luxury of both at once. And then, after all of that, you needed to figure out where the storm had taken you. Because storms did not politely move ships in the direction they were already going. They moved them wherever the wind went, and the wind in a serious storm went in multiple directions over the course of hours. And the dead reckoning position that was your best estimate before the storm was now significantly uncertain in ways that were difficult to quantify. The coast that appeared after a storm was sometimes a welcome sight and sometimes a terrifying one, depending on whether it was the coast you expected to be near. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a medieval ship after a storm has passed, when the wind has dropped to something reasonable, when the sea is still rough but no longer actively murderous, when the immediate crisis is over and the crew has a moment to sit with what just happened. It is the quiet of people who have been genuinely frightened and have come through to the other side, and who are processing the experience in whatever way they individually process it. Some are praying, fulfilling the vows made in the worst of it. Some are simply sitting, staring at the sea, in that particular blank state that follows extreme stress. Some are already working, because there is always work, because a medieval ship never reaches a point where there is no work to do. You sit on the deck in the gray post-storm light, and the ship moves under you with a tiredness that feels like it matches your own. And somewhere below the bilge pump is going, steady and rhythmic, and overhead the ragged edge of a sail that needs repairing flaps in the diminishing wind. And the coast, some coast, you are not entirely sure which one yet, is a dark line on the horizon ahead. You made it through this one. That is genuinely something. Tomorrow there will be another one. Your hands are the first thing you notice, around the third or fourth week at sea. They have always been rough. The work of a sailor makes short business of soft skin. But now there is something different happening. Something that goes beyond the ordinary wear of rope and wood and salt water. The skin around your fingernails is pulling back in a way that is unfamiliar and mildly alarming. Your gums, when you press them with a finger in the dark below deck, feel spongy in a way that gums are not supposed to feel. There is a general, pervasive tiredness that is different from the exhaustion of hard physical work. It is deeper, more systemic, as though the tiredness is coming from somewhere inside rather than from the outside in. You are not sure what this is. Nobody on the ship is sure what this is. The consensus, reached through the informal diagnostic process of sailors comparing symptoms, is that it is probably something to do with the sea air, or the food, or perhaps God's general opinion of the voyage. It is scurvy, and it is going to get worse before it gets better, assuming it gets better at all. The story of disease on medieval ships is really multiple overlapping stories. The story of scurvy, the story of dysentery, the story of the various fevers and infections that moved through close-packed crews with cheerful efficiency, and all of them share a common thread, which is that the medieval understanding of why people got sick was so fundamentally different from the actual mechanisms of disease that the treatments available were, in most cases, somewhere between ineffective and actively harmful. This is not a criticism of medieval medical practitioners, who worked hard and carefully within the framework of understanding available to them. It is just the historical reality that germ theory, vitamin biochemistry, and the mechanisms of infection were not available to the medieval world, and their absence had consequences. The dominant medical framework of the medieval period was humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks and elaborated by Islamic and European scholars across the centuries. In humoral theory, the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health was a state of balance among them, while illness was a state of imbalance. Different diseases corresponded to excesses or deficiencies of different humors, and treatment consisted of restoring balance through interventions designed to reduce or supplement the relevant humor. This framework was internally consistent, intellectually sophisticated, and wrong in its fundamental premises, but it generated treatments that were applied with genuine conviction and professional care. On a medieval ship, the application of humoral medicine to whatever was currently wrong with the crew was the responsibility of whoever on board had the most medical knowledge, which was a category that varied enormously. On large, well-funded vessels, major merchant expeditions, Royal Naval ships, there might be an actual physician or surgeon aboard, a trained professional who had studied at a university or served an apprenticeship and had genuine expertise within the humoral framework. On most ships, medical care was provided by whoever knew the most, which might be the master, who had accumulated practical knowledge over decades of voyaging, or a crew member with some experience, or simply the person who was most confident about what to do, which is not quite the same thing. The ship's surgeon, where one existed, was a figure of considerable importance and considerable limitation simultaneously. He carried a kit of instruments, lancets for bleeding, forceps, needles and thread for suturing wounds, various medicinal preparations in small containers, and he applied them according to the training he had received and the experience he had accumulated. Bleeding, removing blood from a patient by opening a vein, was the Swiss Army knife of medieval medical treatment, applied to an enormous range of conditions on the theory that many illnesses represented an excess of blood or a corrupted state of the blood that needed to be removed. For a sailor who was already malnourished and possibly dehydrated, being bled was exactly the wrong intervention, removing resources from a body that had very few to spare, but it was performed with sincere therapeutic intent. Scurvy, specifically, was a disease that medieval medicine had no framework to understand, because it was caused not by an excess of something but by the absence of something, vitamin C, and the concept of a nutritional deficiency disease did not exist in any form that medieval physicians recognized. The symptoms of scurvy progressed in a consistent and increasingly horrible pattern. It began with the fatigue and the gum changes you noticed, that spongy, bleeding quality that made eating the ship's biscuit even more of an ordeal than it already was. Then came the joint pain, particularly in the legs, a deep aching that made movement difficult. Old wounds and healed injuries began to reopen, which was one of the more disturbing aspects of the disease. Scar tissue that had been stable for years breaking down as the collagen holding it together dissolved. Teeth loosened. Skin developed a rough, spotted appearance. The emotional symptoms, depression, lethargy, a profound psychological flatness, accompanied the physical ones, which meant that the crew was not only getting physically weaker, but losing the motivational resources to manage the psychological demands of the voyage. In its final stages, untreated scurvy was fatal, the body's connective tissue breaking down comprehensively, the heart muscle weakening, hemorrhages developing internally. It killed slowly enough that there was a long period of severe disability before death, which meant that a crew significantly affected by scurvy was also a crew that was progressively less able to handle the ship, creating a cascade of increasing danger as the voyage continued. A ship with a severely scorbutic crew was a ship that was running short of the human capacity to manage itself, which added navigational and seamanship risks to the existing medical ones. The cruel irony, which historians have noted with varying degrees of exasperation on behalf of the dead, is that the cure for scurvy was available in the medieval world. Fresh citrus fruit, lemons, oranges, limes, contained sufficient vitamin C to reverse scurvy symptoms within days of consumption. These fruits were grown and traded in the Mediterranean. They were known to physicians. Various medieval and ancient texts noted, in passing, the beneficial effects of fresh fruit on men who were ill in ways that sound, in retrospect, like scurvy. But the connection between the specific absence of citrus and the specific syndrome of scurvy was not made systematically, and so fresh citrus was not provisioned on ships as a medical precaution, and sailors continued to die of a disease that could have been prevented for a few pennies worth of lemons. Historians still argue about exactly when and where the connection was first understood clearly enough to influence provisioning practice, but the consensus is that it was not during the medieval period, and that is a significant number of preventable deaths. Dysentery was the other great maritime killer, and unlike scurvy it killed faster, sometimes within days of onset in severe cases. Dysentery is an intestinal infection, in the modern understanding, caused by various bacterial or parasitic agents and characterized by severe diarrhea, abdominal cramping, fever, and progressive dehydration. On a medieval ship where the water supply was already compromised, where food preparation hygiene was minimal, where men lived in close proximity and the sanitary arrangements were basic, dysentery spread with the enthusiasm of something that had found exactly the environment it was designed for. The sanitary arrangements on a medieval ship were, to be direct about it, minimal. The toilet facility on a medieval vessel was typically the beakhead, a platform or opening at the bow of the ship, over the water, where you sat or crouched on a wooden seat with a hole in it and conducted your business directly into the sea below. This was exposed to the weather, spray, and the general motion of the ship, and using it in heavy weather required a commitment to the process that went significantly beyond what most people are willing to invest in a bathroom break. In bad weather, sailors sometimes used buckets below deck, which then needed to be emptied over the side, introducing another step in the process and another opportunity for things to go wrong in ways that made the general sanitary situation worse. In this environment, gastrointestinal illness spread efficiently. One sick crew member contaminating the water supply, which happened because medieval understanding of disease transmission did not include the concept of fecal-oral contamination, could produce an outbreak that moved through the entire crew in days. An outbreak of dysentery on a ship was a crisis of the first order, because it simultaneously incapacitated crew members, depleted the water supply through the need for rehydration, and created sanitary conditions that made further spread more likely. The medieval treatment, rest, bland food, various herbal preparations with mild astringent properties, addressed the symptoms rather than the cause, and outcomes depended heavily on the severity of the infecting agent and the baseline health of the individual, which on a malnourished, vitamin-depleted crew was not always good. Fevers were another consistent presence, a broad category that covered everything from malaria contracted in southern ports to typhus, spread by lice, which were absolutely present on medieval ships, to various other infections that produced elevated temperature and systemic illness. The medieval physician's response to fever was typically to attempt to reduce it through bleeding, purging, or the application of cooling substances, none of which addressed the underlying cause. Malaria in particular was a disease that the medieval world encountered repeatedly in Mediterranean and North African ports without understanding its mechanism. The connection between mosquitoes, the parasite they carried, and the recurring fevers they caused was not established until the late 19th century, which meant that medieval sailors who contracted malaria and then recovered would relapse at intervals throughout their lives without knowing why. Wounds and injuries were a constant on a working ship. Cuts from tools, rope burns, crushing injuries from cargo, falls from the rigging. The management of wounds on a medieval ship was a mixture of practical competence and theoretical error. Cleaning wounds, binding them, setting broken bones, these things were done, and often done effectively by the standards of the era. The problem was infection, because medieval medicine did not understand that wounds became infected because microorganisms entered them, and therefore did not take the precautions, sterile instruments, clean dressings, antiseptic treatment, that would have prevented infection. Wounds that would be trivial in the modern world, properly treated, became serious on a medieval ship, because the environment was full of the things that cause infection and empty of anything that effectively prevented it. The treatment of infected wounds was one area where medieval medicine sometimes stumbled accidentally into effectiveness. Wine and vinegar, used to clean wounds in various maritime traditions, had mild antiseptic properties that were real even if the theoretical explanation for them was wrong. Honey, used as a wound dressing in some traditions, is genuinely antimicrobial. Cauterization, burning the wound closed with a heated iron, was brutal but effective at sterilizing contaminated tissue. These treatments were not understood as fighting infection, but they sometimes worked anyway, which is an interesting example of empirical knowledge outrunning theoretical understanding by centuries. Amputation was the ultimate surgical intervention for severely infected limbs, and it was performed on medieval ships when necessary, with the instruments available and whatever anesthetic effect could be achieved with alcohol and poppy preparations. Ship surgeons who performed amputations at sea were working in conditions, movement, inadequate light, no sterile field, limited assistance, that would horrify a modern surgeon, and the survival rates for maritime amputations were not high. But they were sometimes the only alternative to certain death from spreading infection, and they were performed with the conviction that they were the right treatment because they often were. The mental health of medieval sailors was not a category that medieval medicine formally addressed as such, but the psychological stresses of extended voyaging were real and their effects were visible in the historical record. Prolonged confinement in a small space with the same people, persistent fear, disrupted sleep from watch rotations, nutritional deficiency affecting cognitive function and mood, the accumulated stress of repeated danger. All of these had psychological consequences that manifested as depression, anxiety, irritability, and conflict. The medieval understanding of these states was religious and moral rather than medical. A sailor who was deeply depressed might be seen as suffering from spiritual crisis rather than psychological illness, and the interventions were pastoral rather than therapeutic. Prayer, the sacraments, the comfort of religious community, these were the primary psychological support available on a medieval ship, and it would be condescending and inaccurate to dismiss their effectiveness entirely. Religious belief provided a framework for making meaning of suffering, a source of hope in circumstances where material hope was limited, and a community of practice that structured the social life of the ship. The patron saints of sailors were not invoked frivolously. They were called upon with genuine urgency by men who understood the limits of human capability and were reaching for something beyond it. But prayer did not cure scurvy, and it did not stop dysentery, and it could not set a compound fracture under conditions that prevented infection from developing. The gap between the medical needs of medieval sailors and the medical resources available to them was vast and consequential, and it was filled, in the end, with the same thing that filled every other gap on a medieval ship: the endurance of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances, managing as best they could with what they had, surviving when they could, and dying when they couldn't with whatever dignity the sea chose to allow them. It begins, usually, around the 5th or 6th week. Not for everyone, and not in the same way. It is more like a shift in the texture of the voyage, a subtle change in the quality of the time passing. The ocean has been the same ocean for weeks. The horizon has been the same horizon, an unbroken circle of gray-green water meeting gray-white sky, day after day, with nothing to interrupt it, nothing to mark progress, nothing to indicate that the world contains anything other than this ship, this crew, and this endless, featureless expanse of moving water. The work continues, the watch rotations, the pumping, the rigging maintenance, the cooking, the eating of things that are increasingly difficult to think of as food. But beneath the work, something is changing in the minds of the men around you, and in your own mind too, in ways that are gradual enough to be difficult to notice until they are already well advanced. The human brain was not designed for the open ocean. This is not a metaphor, it is a practical statement about the sensory and social environment that human cognition developed to process, and the open ocean is not that environment. Human beings evolved in landscapes with variety, with near and far objects, with changing scenes, with the social complexity of groups larger than 20 people, with the constant input of new information to process and respond to. A medieval ship on the open ocean offered almost none of this. The visual environment was essentially static. The same water, the same sky, the same ship, the same faces. The social environment was a fixed group of perhaps 15 to 25 people, the same people every day, in a space that offered no privacy and no escape from each other. The informational environment was minimal. Nothing new was happening, nothing was changing. The news from the outside world had stopped at the moment of departure and would not resume until arrival, if arrival happened. The psychological consequences of this environment were real, documented in enough medieval and early modern accounts to constitute a pattern, and they ranged from the mildly uncomfortable to the genuinely alarming. Sleep disturbances were common, not just from the watch rotation schedule and the noise and motion of the ship, but from a kind of restless wakefulness that settled over long voyage crews, a difficulty quieting a mind that had insufficient input to process during the day and compensated at night with vivid, disturbing dreams. Appetite disruption accompanied the nutritional problems. Some sailors lost interest in food beyond what hunger strictly demanded, a flattening of normal desire that the medieval world might have described as melancholy and we might recognize as a symptom of depression. Irritability increased. Conflicts that would have been trivial on land became significant on the ship, and the social dynamics of a small crew under stress developed the particular brittleness of relationships that cannot be escaped. And then there were the things that people saw. Sea monster sightings are one of the most consistently reported phenomena in medieval maritime accounts, appearing across different cultures, different eras, different oceans, with a consistency that demands some explanation. The kraken, the sea serpent, the giant fish that could swallow a ship, the creature that appeared like a floating island until sailors landed on it and it dove beneath them. These are not the inventions of credulous landlubbers embellishing sailors' tales. They appear in the accounts of experienced mariners, described with the specificity of eyewitness testimony, reported with the matter-of-fact tone of men recording what they had seen rather than what they imagined. Historians still argue about what exactly medieval sailors were seeing when they reported sea monsters, whether the accounts represent misidentified real animals, optical phenomena of the ocean surface, mass hallucination driven by stress and nutritional deficiency, or something else entirely, and the argument has not been definitively resolved. The real animals of the ocean are, in fairness, genuinely spectacular. Giant squid, the Architeuthis, which can reach lengths of 13 meters or more, existed in the medieval ocean as they exist today, and a giant squid glimpsed at the surface, its long tentacles trailing, its enormous eyes breaking the water, in poor light, after weeks at sea, is an experience that might reasonably be reported as something monstrous. Whale encounters were common on medieval Atlantic routes, and whales behave in ways, breaching, slapping the water with their flukes, surfacing unexpectedly alongside a ship, that were startling and sometimes dangerous when a large whale surfaced very close to a small vessel. Oarfish, those extraordinary ribbon-shaped creatures that can reach 10 meters in length and swim near the surface when ill or dying, look like nothing else in the ocean. And look, if you have been at sea for 6 weeks and your vitamin C levels are critically low, like exactly what you always feared was down there. The hallucination hypothesis deserves serious consideration because the conditions that produce hallucinations in humans were present on medieval ships in abundance. Severe sleep deprivation, which was a consistent feature of the watch rotation system, where you might get 4 hours of sleep before being back on watch, produces visual hallucinations that are well documented and well understood in modern sleep research. Nutritional deficiency, particularly the vitamin B deficiencies that accompanied the medieval sailors' diet alongside the vitamin C deficiency of scurvy, also produces neurological symptoms that can include visual disturbances. Dehydration affected cognitive function in ways that the sailors experiencing it could not have recognized or named. And the sensory monotony of the open ocean created conditions where the brain, starved of input, began generating its own, the visual equivalent of the ringing ears that people experience in truly silent environments. A famous quirk from maritime history, and a genuinely peculiar one, is the phenomenon known as fata morgana, a complex mirage that occurs in specific atmospheric conditions over cold water and produces images of coastlines, islands, castles, and ships that appear with extraordinary clarity on the horizon before dissolving. Fata Morgana mirages have been documented by modern observers with cameras, and they are remarkably convincing, detailed, solid-looking, apparently real. For a medieval sailor who did not understand the optics of temperature inversion layers in the atmosphere, a fata morgana on the horizon was indistinguishable from an actual coastline, and the disorientation of navigating toward something that then vanished was both practically dangerous and profoundly unsettling in a way that fed the general psychological atmosphere of unease. Superstition on medieval ships was not the primitive irrationality that later, more confident eras sometimes characterized it as. It was the rational response of people operating in an environment of genuine, irreducible uncertainty, using the cognitive tools available to them to manage that uncertainty. If you cannot control the weather, you can at least avoid the things that are believed to bring bad weather. If you cannot guarantee the voyage will succeed, you can at least perform the rituals and observe the taboos that experienced sailors associate with successful voyages. Medieval maritime superstition was a practical system, in its own terms, for navigating uncertainty, a set of risk management strategies dressed in the language of the supernatural. The list of maritime superstitions that appear in medieval and early modern sources is long, specific, and occasionally delightful. Whistling on a ship was widely considered dangerous. It was believed to whistle up the wind, which sounds like something you might want but is not when the wind you whistle up is more than you wanted. Women on ships were considered bad luck in various northern European maritime traditions, a belief that probably had less to do with supernatural mechanics and more to do with the social disruption that the presence of women in an all-male crew environment could produce, dressed in supernatural language for convenience. Certain words were taboo. In some Scottish fishing traditions, the word rabbit could not be spoken aboard a vessel, and in others a whole vocabulary of ordinary words had maritime substitutes to be used at sea. Killing certain seabirds, the albatross in later maritime tradition, various other species in medieval accounts, was considered extraordinarily unlucky, a belief that may have had practical roots in the navigational usefulness of seabirds as indicators of land and fish. The animals of the sea featured prominently in the medieval sailor's mental landscape in ways that went beyond practical navigation. Dolphins following a ship were widely considered good luck, perhaps because dolphin behavior around ships was genuinely friendly and the association felt meaningful, or perhaps because dolphins near the surface indicated something about sea conditions. The behavior of seabirds was read as omen and information simultaneously. A gannet diving indicated fish below, which indicated productive fishing grounds, which was useful practical information, and the same gannet might also be read as a sign from a patron saint about the voyage's prospects, and these two readings coexisted without contradiction in the medieval mind. The patron saint system of medieval maritime culture deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it was not simply decorative religion, it was a functional psychological technology for managing the specific stresses of seafaring. St. Elmo's fire, the electrical discharge that appears on the tips of masts and rigging during certain atmospheric conditions, producing an eerie blue-white glow, was interpreted in the medieval tradition as the visible presence of St. Elmo, a martyr bishop who had become the patron of sailors, and his appearance was considered a sign of protection during storms. The phenomenon is real, it is a well-understood atmospheric electrical effect, and it did appear during storms, and interpreting it as divine protection in the worst moments of a storm provided genuine psychological stabilization in circumstances where psychological stabilization was desperately needed. Whether or not the theological interpretation was correct, the functional effect of believing you were protected was real and had real consequences for how men behaved under extreme stress. The madness of long voyages, not the clinical madness of specific psychiatric disorders, but the general psychological deterioration that extended isolation and hardship produced, was documented enough in the medieval period to be a recognized phenomenon, even if it was not understood in modern psychological terms. The social fabric of a medieval ship crew under prolonged stress developed stress fractures that widened over time. Men who had been functional crewmates in the first weeks of a voyage became sources of tension, conflict, and sometimes serious disruption in the later stages. Grudges accumulated. Small slights became large grievances. The authority of the master, which depended partly on the crew's willingness to accept it, became more difficult to maintain as men became more desperate and less able to regulate their responses to frustration and fear. The medieval ship was, in this sense, a social pressure cooker, a fixed group of people in a confined space under escalating stress, with no exit, no privacy, no external social input, and limited resources for managing conflict. The watch system helped because it divided the crew into groups that were rarely all awake simultaneously, reducing the social density at any given moment. The work helped too. Purposeful physical activity is genuinely useful for psychological regulation, and a ship always had work to do, which kept men's hands and bodies occupied even when their minds were struggling. But these were partial solutions to a profound problem, and the longer the voyage went on, the more partial they became. There is something in the medieval sailor's experience of the open ocean that is genuinely hard to translate across the centuries. The combination of the vastness, the isolation, the monotony, the fear, and the strange, reluctant beauty of the sea itself. Medieval maritime accounts, even the practical ones recording distances and provisions and weather, sometimes break into a different register when describing the ocean at night, the phosphorescence trailing from the hull in the dark water, glowing with cold blue-green light, the stars overhead in quantities only visible far from land, the sound of the ship moving through the water in the quiet watches. There was something in the open ocean that moved these men, even as it frightened them, even as it was killing them slowly with bad food and no vitamin C and the accumulated stress of weeks of fear. The sea monster that you see on the 7th week, off the port bow in the gray pre-dawn light, that dark shape that rises and moves and is either a whale or something very large and very strange, is real enough to you. You watch it for a long moment. Another sailor nearby watches it too, says nothing. The shape slides below the surface and is gone, and the sea is just the sea again, dark and vast and utterly indifferent to what you thought you saw. You say nothing about it. You go back to work. The horizon is the same horizon it has been for 7 weeks, a perfect circle with nothing in it, and the ship moves through the center of it, and the world is just this, and you are still here, which is the only thing that matters, the only achievement that counts, the only story that ends well. The sail appears on the horizon in the early afternoon, and the first thing you feel is not relief. Relief would be the response of someone who has forgotten where they are and what kind of world this is. What you feel, instead, is a careful, practiced wariness. The particular alertness of a man who has learned that another ship on the horizon is not automatically good news, and might be very bad news indeed, and that the difference between those two outcomes will become clear over the next hour or so as the distance closes and the other vessel's intentions declare themselves through the language of how it moves, what flags it flies, and how many men are visible on its deck. The human threats that medieval sailors faced were, in some ways, more psychologically difficult than the natural ones, because nature was indifferent and people were not. A storm was trying to kill you because storms try to kill everything and nothing personal was intended. A pirate was trying to kill you or rob you or enslave you with deliberate intent and active planning, and that specificity of malice added a dimension to the danger that weather and disease did not have. You could not negotiate with a storm. With the sail on the horizon, there was at least the theoretical possibility of outcomes other than the worst one, and the theoretical possibility of outcomes much worse than anything a storm would think to devise. Piracy in the medieval world was not the romantic, swashbuckling enterprise of popular imagination. Not yet, anyway. The golden age of piracy was still centuries away, with its codes and its flags and its complicated social structure. Medieval piracy was more straightforward and more brutal. It was robbery at sea, conducted by whoever had a fast enough vessel, enough men, and fewer scruples than their targets. It was also, crucially, not always clearly distinguishable from legitimate maritime activity, because the line between piracy, privateering, and authorized naval action was in the medieval period remarkably thin, frequently crossed, and often invisible from the deck of the ship being targeted. Privateering, the practice of licensed piracy, essentially, where a government or lord issued a letter of marque authorizing a ship to attack and plunder vessels of enemy nations, was widespread in the medieval period and created a class of maritime predator who was technically legal from one perspective and a pirate from another, depending entirely on whose perspective you adopted and which nation's flag your ship flew. An English privateer attacking a French merchant vessel during a period of Anglo-French conflict was performing a patriotic and authorized act from the English perspective and committing piracy from the French one. The merchant sailor whose cargo was being taken at sword point probably found the distinction academic. The geography of medieval piracy followed the geography of trade, which makes complete sense. Pirates, like any rational economic actor, positioned themselves where the returns were highest. The English Channel was one of the most piracy-prone stretches of water in the medieval world, because it was also one of the busiest, funneling the enormous trade between northern and southern Europe through a relatively narrow passage where interception was straightforward. The North Sea had its own persistent piracy problem, particularly during periods when Scandinavian political instability produced men with ships and limited options for legitimate employment. The Mediterranean had piracy from multiple directions and multiple cultural traditions. North African corsairs, Genoese and Venetian naval entrepreneurs, Greek island-based raiders, and the complexity of political relationships in the medieval Mediterranean meant that the same vessel might be a legitimate trader in one port and a pirate in another. The Baltic Sea, dominated in the later medieval period by the Hanseatic League, that remarkable confederation of northern European merchant cities, had its own piracy problem in the form of the Vitalienbrüder, a group of privateers who began their careers with legitimate letters of marque during a Scandinavian political conflict and continued operating after those letters had expired and no longer provided legal cover, because the piracy business had proven lucrative enough to continue without authorization. The Vitalienbrüder were eventually suppressed, but their career illustrated a consistent pattern of medieval maritime life. The easy slide from authorized violence to unauthorized violence when the authorization ran out and the opportunity remained. What happened when a pirate vessel caught you depended on a number of variables, and the outcomes ranged from survivable to catastrophic. The best case was a negotiated surrender. You presented no resistance, the pirates took the cargo, possibly took some of the ship's equipment and supplies, and left you with enough to limp to the nearest port. This happened. Cargo was replaceable, at least in principle, and pirates who had a reputation for not murdering crews who surrendered peacefully were, in a perverse way, providing a service to future targets by making surrender an appealing option. A pirate who murdered everyone regardless of resistance removed the incentive to surrender peacefully and made every encounter a fight to the death, which was bad for business. The realistic middle case was significantly worse. Medieval pirates took prisoners when prisoners were valuable, and sailors and merchants could be valuable, as ransomable individuals if they came from wealthy families, or as slaves if they didn't. The Mediterranean slave trade in the medieval period was active and involved multiple cultural and religious groups as both perpetrators and victims. Christian sailors captured by North African corsairs could find themselves sold into slavery in North African markets. Muslim sailors and merchants captured by Christian naval forces could face similar outcomes. The galley slave, a man chained to an or on a war galley, rowing under the threat of the lash, was not a figure of fiction. He was a documented reality of medieval Mediterranean maritime life, and the men condemned to it included sailors who had simply been in the wrong place when a faster vessel caught them. The worst case was violence without negotiation, a pirate crew that killed as it took, either out of operational habit to eliminate witnesses or simply because the opportunity for violence presented itself and the culture of the group normalized it. Medieval piracy produced genuine atrocities, documented in enough detail in contemporary records to make clear that the violence was real and systematic rather than incidental. Ships were burned with crews aboard. Captives were killed after torture. Cargo crews were massacred to prevent them from reporting the attack or identifying the attackers. These were not routine outcomes. Most piracy was mercenary rather than sadistic, but they were possible outcomes, and the possibility was part of the background radiation of threat that a medieval sailor navigated constantly. The defensive options available to a merchant vessel were limited but not negligible. Merchant ships in high-risk waters carried weapons, crossbows, pikes, swords, and in the later medieval period, primitive firearms, and the crew was expected to fight if necessary. Some merchant vessels were built with defensive features. Raised platforms at bow and stern called castles, which gave defenders a height advantage over boarding attackers, and which gave the medieval ship its characteristic silhouette. Traveling in convoy, multiple merchant vessels moving together, was the most effective defensive strategy, because pirates generally preferred prey that could be taken without significant resistance, and a convoy presented a more challenging target than a lone vessel. The Hanseatic League formalized convoy practices into something approaching a system, which was one of the reasons it was so commercially successful. It provided its member merchants with collective security that individual merchants could not afford alone. But convoys required coordination, and coordination in the medieval period meant delay. waiting for other ships to be ready, adjusting your route and timing to match the convoy schedule, arriving at your destination later than you might have managed alone. For merchants operating on tight financial margins, the security of a convoy had to be weighed against the commercial cost of the delay it imposed, and individual merchants often made the calculation that the risk of solo sailing was worth accepting. This calculation was sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong, in that way that statistical thinking always sounds reasonable and specific outcomes are always either fine or terrible with nothing in between. Rival navies were another human threat that operated differently from piracy but overlapped with it in ways that were practically important for the sailor caught in between. Medieval naval warfare was not conducted by professional standing navies in the modern sense. It was conducted by assemblages of merchant vessels and their crews, pressed or hired into royal service, supported by whatever dedicated warships the crown maintained, fighting for political and commercial objectives that the ordinary sailor below deck understood only vaguely. If your ship was caught between two naval forces in conflict, the outcomes were not significantly better than if you had been caught by pirates, and the political legitimacy of the forces involved offered you no practical protection. The English and French crowns spent significant portions of the medieval period in various states of armed conflict, and the English Channel was periodically a war zone through which commercial shipping had to navigate as best it could. The 100 Years' War, that extraordinary prolonged conflict that dragged on from 1337 to 1453, made channel crossing a genuinely dangerous enterprise for significant periods, with naval engagements, privateering raids, and outright piracy blurring into a general atmosphere of maritime insecurity that disrupted trade and cost sailors their lives in numbers that are difficult to quantify but were certainly significant. The threat from within the ship was perhaps the most insidious of all, because it was the hardest to see coming. Mutiny, the overthrow of the ship's command by the crew, was the extreme end of a spectrum of internal conflict that medieval ships experienced regularly and in milder forms. At the mild end was grumbling and passive resistance, sailors doing the minimum required, working slowly, expressing dissatisfaction through reduced effort rather than open defiance. In the middle were more active protests, collective refusals to perform specific tasks, demands for changed conditions or increased pay, confrontations between crew members and officers that stopped short of violence but made the exercise of authority difficult. At the extreme end was organized mutiny, the seizure of the ship from its command, which happened in the medieval period, and the records of it, where they survive, make for uncomfortable reading. The conditions that produced mutiny were generally the conditions of extreme desperation. Provisions failing, the voyage lasting far longer than expected, a master whose decisions the crew had lost confidence in, a specific crisis that brought accumulated grievances to a head. Historians still argue about whether medieval sailors had anything resembling a concept of collective rights that justified resistance to authority, or whether mutiny was always understood as straightforwardly criminal, a violation of the contract of employment and the hierarchical order of the ship. The legal treatment of mutiny in the medieval period was severe. Mutineers who were caught faced punishments that ranged from severe flogging to execution, but the legal framework had to reckon with the practical reality that a ship at sea was a closed environment where the crew vastly outnumbered the officers, and authority ultimately rested on consent that could be withdrawn. The violence among crew members that fell short of mutiny, fights, assaults, the settling of grudges through physical confrontation, was common enough to be regulated by the articles that governed ship conduct. Medieval ship articles, the written or verbal agreements that established the rules of conduct for a voyage, typically included provisions about fighting, with specified penalties for drawing a weapon on a fellow crew member, for striking an officer, for various categories of interpersonal violence. The penalties were physical and immediate. Flogging was the standard disciplinary instrument, and were intended to maintain the order that a ship required to function. Whether they always succeeded is another matter, because the conditions that produced violence among the crew were also the conditions that made rational assessment of consequences difficult, and a man who was desperate, exhausted, hungry, and frightened was not always well positioned to make the calculation that starting a fight was going to end badly for him. So the sail on the horizon resolves itself, as the afternoon progresses, into a merchant vessel flying colors you recognize, a Flemish trader, perhaps, or an English coaster, moving in roughly the same direction as you. The specific, controlled anxiety of the last hour relaxes fractionally. Not entirely. In the medieval ocean there are no guarantees, and a vessel that looks friendly at a distance has occasionally proven otherwise at close range, but fractionally. You watch it pass at a comfortable distance, and the other ship watches you, and there is something in that exchange of mutual recognition. Two small wooden vessels in an enormous sea, both aware of all the things that could go wrong and both, for this moment, not going wrong. That is almost companionable. The horizon behind it is clear. Ahead of you is wherever you are going, still a matter of navigation and weather and time. But for right now, the human threats are elsewhere, and that is, in the context of medieval seafaring, something approaching good news. The coast appears on a Tuesday, though you have lost enough track of the days that you are not entirely certain it is Tuesday. It might be Wednesday. At some point in the 6th week, the calendar became theoretical rather than practical, a system of counting that continued in principle but had lost its connection to any meaningful change in your circumstances, because every day at sea was essentially the same day. The same water, the same sky, the same work, the same food, the same faces, and the accumulation of those identical days into weeks and the weeks into something approaching 2 months had happened more like geological time than human time, slowly and without landmark. But now there is a landmark. There is, on the horizon ahead, a darkness that is not cloud and not sea, that has the particular quality of solidity that the ocean has been withholding from you for the entire voyage, and your body recognizes it before your mind has finished processing it. A physical response, something loosening in the chest, something releasing in the shoulders, that is older and more fundamental than rational thought. Land, actual solid, non-moving land. The coast of somewhere, and you are almost certain it is the correct somewhere, which is a navigational triumph that the master is accepting with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew it would work out and is not going to admit how uncertain he was for significant portions of the voyage. The approach to port after a long medieval voyage was not the triumphant homecoming of imagination. It was a careful, tense, technically demanding piece of seamanship that required the crew to shift from the long voyage mode, endurance, routine, maintenance, to the alert, precise work of coastal navigation and harbor entry, at exactly the moment when the crew was least equipped to do so. You were tired. You were malnourished. Some of you were sick. The ship had accumulated the physical wear of the voyage, the rigging that had been repaired but not replaced, the sails that had been patched in ways that held but were not ideal, the hull that was leaking a little more than it had at departure. Bringing this vessel, with this crew, into a medieval harbor required attention and skill that the voyage had been systematically eroding for weeks. Harbors in the medieval period were not the engineered, navigated, buoyed, and lit facilities of the modern world. They were natural anchorages improved by human effort to varying degrees. A breakwater here, a quay there, a lighthouse of some kind at the entrance if the harbor was prosperous and organized enough to maintain one. The approaches were known to local pilots, men whose specific expertise was knowing the particular harbor, its depths, its hazards, its tidal behavior, its prevailing winds, and larger vessels arriving from distant ports would typically take on a local pilot for the final approach. A transaction that acknowledged the limits of the master's knowledge and the specificity of the local experts. The pilot came out in a small boat, climbed aboard, took charge of the final navigation, and the master stood aside with whatever grace he could manage, which was sometimes quite a lot and sometimes not very much at all. The entry into harbor after a long voyage was, even under these cautious and careful conditions, a moment of intense and genuine emotion that the medieval accounts do not always capture directly, but whose presence you can feel between the lines. The smell of land reached you before the harbor itself, the particular complex smell of a medieval port, which was many things simultaneously, very few of them pleasant by modern standards, but all of them meaning that the ocean was behind you and solid ground was ahead. Wood smoke. The organic richness of a town's accumulated waste. Animal smells. Food smells, actual food smells, the smell of things cooking that were not salt pork boiled in a cauldron. These reached you on the offshore breeze, and your malnourished, salt-preserved, vitamin-depleted body responded to them with something that was almost painful in its intensity, the olfactory equivalent of coming home. And then the harbor itself, the familiar chaos of a working medieval port, the quays crowded with boats and barrels, the shouts of dock workers, the calling of merchants and factors, the sound of a town going about its business in all directions, the sheer noise of human activity after weeks in which the only sounds had been the wind, the water, the rigging, and 20-odd voices you had heard say everything they had to say at least 3 times. The noise was overwhelming in the best possible way, the kind of overwhelm that comes from abundance rather than assault. Getting off the ship was its own process. The mooring, the customs inspection if the harbor authority required one, the unloading of cargo, all of which had to happen before the crew was free to go ashore. Medieval port authorities had varying degrees of bureaucratic sophistication, but the major trading ports of the period maintained customs operations that required arriving ships to declare their cargo, pay applicable duties, and in some cases wait in the harbor until the inspection was complete and clearance given. This waiting, after weeks at sea and with the dock clearly visible and solid ground so close, was a particular torment that medieval sailors complained about with a specificity that suggests it was a consistent and deeply felt grievance. When you finally got ashore, the first thing your legs told you was that land was wrong. This is one of the more disorienting physiological experiences available to the returning sailor. The ground does not move. It should move. Your vestibular system has spent weeks recalibrating for a world that was in constant motion, adjusting its baseline, filing new reports about what normal felt like, and normal, it had concluded, felt like the ship rolling, pitching, moving. Solid ground, refusing to move in any of those expected ways, felt profoundly incorrect to a body that had forgotten it. You walked on the dock with the careful, slightly lurching gait of a man who was expecting the world to shift and kept being wrong, and the dock workers and townspeople watched you with the amused recognition of people who had seen sailors come ashore before and knew what it looked like. This condition, called mal de débarquement in later periods, the sickness of disembarkation, resolved over hours to days as the vestibular system recalibrated back to land. But in the meantime, it contributed to the general physical strangeness of return, layered on top of the weakness from malnutrition, the joint pain of early scurvy, the digestive chaos that followed the reintroduction of actual food to a system that had been running on hardtack and salt meat for 2 months. Coming home was physically difficult in ways that nobody who hadn't done it could easily understand, and the returning sailor who staggered on the dock and looked gray and moved slowly was not performing. He was genuinely, systematically depleted in ways that would take weeks to reverse. The pay, when it came, was the material reward for everything you had survived, and it was frequently disappointing in ways that medieval sailors were not in a position to do much about. The wages you had been promised were subject to deductions, for advances taken before departure, for equipment lost or damaged, for various fees and levies that the master or the merchant employer applied according to systems that were not always transparent or fair. The share of cargo profits that some sailors were entitled to depended on the cargo selling at a price that the merchant negotiated, and the sailor had no involvement in and limited visibility into that negotiation. Royal naval wages were paid when the crown got around to it, which was often later than promised and sometimes not in full. There was also the question of what had happened to crew members who had not survived the voyage. Death at sea created administrative complications for the medieval period. The wages owed to a dead man were theoretically payable to his heirs or family, but in practice the mechanisms for transferring those wages were imperfect, and the families of sailors who died at sea were not always in a position to pursue their claims effectively. A sailor's widow in a medieval port town, trying to recover her husband's wages from a merchant who was in no particular hurry to pay, was in a weak position in almost every relevant dimension, legally, economically, socially, and the outcomes for these women and their children were often poor. The shore leave that followed pay, assuming pay came promptly enough to fund it, followed patterns that were consistent enough across the medieval period to constitute something like a tradition. Taverns received the returning sailor with the reliable enthusiasm of establishments that understood their market. Ale and wine flowed in quantities that were medically inadvisable for men whose bodies had been under sustained stress and whose tolerance had adjusted downward during the dry stretches of the voyage. Food was consumed with an intensity of appetite that the shoreside observer found remarkable and the sailor found entirely natural. Real food, varied food, food that did not require tapping on the table first, and the gastrointestinal consequences of this enthusiasm, imposed on a system accustomed to the ship's rations, were predictable and unpleasant. The social world of the port town received the returning crew like water receiving a stone. A splash, some ripples, and then the water settled back into its normal shape and the stone was simply there, among all the other stones. Medieval port communities were accustomed to sailors. They had the infrastructure for dealing with them, the taverns and the boarding houses and the various other establishments that serviced maritime workers, and the social tolerance for their behavior that came from long familiarity. They also had the pragmatic wariness of communities that had learned, from experience, what a group of men who had been at sea for 2 months and had just been paid were capable of. And the town watch in major medieval ports was a notably active institution on the evenings following a fleet's return. If you had survived the voyage with your health more or less intact, the question that arose now, after the pay, after the shore leave, after the slow physical recovery of the first weeks on land, was what came next. And for the medieval sailor, what came next was, almost always, another voyage. Not immediately, perhaps, there was a season to wait for, or a cargo to be assembled, or a ship to be refitted, but the sea was not a single experience you had and moved on from. It was a career, a life, a repeating cycle of departure and return that structured a sailor's entire existence and the existence of his family around it. The mortality rate among medieval sailors was high enough that careers were statistically shorter than those of most land occupations, and the cumulative physical damage of repeated voyages, the progressive joint damage, the repeated nutritional insults, the accumulated injuries, meant that sailors who lived long enough to retire did so with bodies that bore the full record of their working lives. An old sailor in a medieval port town, truly old, which might mean his 50s, was a man who had survived things that had killed many of his contemporaries, and the survival itself was a kind of achievement, though the medieval world did not have the vocabulary to frame it quite that way. What kept men going back, after all of it, after the food and the weather and the pirates and the disease and the navigational terror and the psychological erosion and the inadequate pay, is a question that the records answer only indirectly, through the evidence of men who did go back. Voyage after voyage, year after year, until they couldn't anymore. The economic answer is straightforward. There was no better option for most of them, and the sea, terrible as it was, paid. But economics alone does not fully account for the consistency with which medieval sailors returned to a life they knew was dangerous, because the danger was not abstract or distant. They had lived it, they knew exactly what it involved, and they went back anyway. There was something else in it. Something in the particular quality of the sea's indifference. The way the ocean did not care about your social status or your family's history or the political situation in your home country. The way it applied the same conditions to everyone and required the same fundamental competence from everyone, that offered a kind of equality unavailable on land. Something in the community of the crew, rough and difficult and sometimes violent as it was, that had the intensity of shared survival, the bond forged by having been afraid together and come through together. Something in the motion of the ship on the water, once you had adjusted to it, that was its own kind of peace. And something, perhaps, in the horizon itself. The medieval sailor's horizon was not a limit, it was a possibility, the edge of what was known and the beginning of what wasn't, and beyond it were places and things and experiences that the village or the town or the farm could never provide. The world was large and most of it was water and the water was the road, and the men who sailed it were the ones who went, rather than staying. And there is in that choice, however constrained by economics and circumstance it was, something that speaks to a part of the human character that does not sit comfortably still. You stand on the dock in the evening light, watching the ship being unloaded, and the harbor moves around you with its noise and its smell and its reassuring solidity, and your legs have almost stopped expecting the ground to move. The pay was less than you hoped. 2 men did not come back with you. Fever took one in the 5th week, and the sea took the other in the storm you would rather not think about too carefully. The cargo arrived, which means the merchant is satisfied, which means there will be another voyage, probably in the spring, probably to somewhere you have been before, possibly to somewhere you haven't. And either way the ship will be refitted and provisioned and the crew assembled and the dock will slowly pull away again and the smell of the town will fade behind you and ahead there will be just the water. You watch the harbor for a long time as the light fails and the evening comes in off the sea, bringing with it the smell of salt and cold water and the particular clean emptiness of the ocean, and something in you, the part that endured and adapted and survived, the part that learned the ship and the sea and the sky in ways that no landlocked person could easily understand, recognizes that smell as something more than just the wind off the water. It smells like where you live. And so we let the harbor settle into evening, and the sailor rest on the dock, and the ship creak quietly at its moorings in the gathering dark. The water laps against the stone with a sound that has been the same sound for all the centuries of all the sailors who have stood in places like this and felt what this sailor feels now. The complicated mix of relief and exhaustion and something that is not quite longing but is close to it. The feeling of a person who belongs to two worlds and is fully at home in neither. The medieval ocean was a hard place, and the men who worked it were shaped by it in ways we can only partly imagine from here, warm and still and safe in our beds. They ate the weevilled biscuit and pumped the bilge and navigated by starlight and survived the storms and came home, and then they went back because that was the life and the life was theirs. Let that image drift now. The harbor, the evening, the sailor on the dock, the ship resting at its mooring. Let the sounds of the port soften and slow, the noise of the town fading like a tide going out, leaving behind only the quiet and the gentle rhythm of water against stone. You are warm. You are still. The ground beneath you does not move, and that is a gift that the medieval sailor knew the value of better than almost anyone. Your breath slows. The harbor is quiet. The sea, somewhere beyond all of this, is doing what the sea has always done. Moving, breathing, vast and patient and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they are too large to fully comprehend. Let it go. Let the voyage end. You made it back. Sleep well.